Good evening. I'm going to follow the hard conversation with the numerical conversation and try not to lose you along the way. So I'll do my best to be concise. Again, congratulations and thank you for joining me. So what I am presenting tonight is because school districts are required by statute to file 2 financial reports during the fiscal year. These are called interim reports. This is first of 2. This covers the period in terms of financial activity that ends October 31st. And it also recommends budgetary adjustments to the current fiscal year to the budget that was originally adopted by the Board of Trustees on June 11th, 2024. Again, that was before the fiscal year started. So now we're into the fiscal year. We have assumptions that have changed, and now this is an opportunity to present those changing budgetary assumptions to the board. This report and the presentation that's going to follow is really going to track 3. It's going to provide an update to the district's financial condition. It's going to recommend revisions to that budget in revenues and in expenditures. And then it's going to take those proposed budget revisions, use it as a base, and then project out 2 years. That, in essence, is the first interim report. The board's role is to certify the condition of the district's financials as to whether the district can meet its obligations in the current and following 2 fiscal years as defined by the state minimum of a 4% reserve. You're establishing that as a board of trustees, as fiscal stewards of the district. So the agenda for today, over the next couple of slides as I go through, I already went through what the first interim is. I'll go through for a new trustee where this lies in that budget cycle. I'll talk about the budget revisions on revenue and the budget revisions on expenditures. I'll tie that together into the projected ending year balance, use that as a base to do a multi-year projection. And for each of the budgetary line items, I will also speak to the why. So I'll track to how the district actually ended the fiscal year last year, compare it to the budget that was originally adopted in June, and then draw a conclusion and recommend by category why we are making an adjustment for the budget in this year. Then we're going to go into just a cash flow projection, which ties to the ending fund balance of this year, speak to some of the other funds, such as food service, and then talk briefly about next steps and where the school year goes. That's the agenda. So at this point, right off the bat, the district does recommend that the Board of Trustees certify at first interim that the district will be able to meet its financial obligations for the current fiscal year and subsequent 2 fiscal years. So where are we? In the budget cycle, we are at first interim. This is being approved as of December. Again, this follows the budget for adoption that occurred back in June before the fiscal year started. I think what's helpful is noting that the audit findings, which is going to be presented to the Board of Trustees in January, is already integrated into the first interim budget. Okay, so just keep in mind, when I reference the 23-24 fiscal year, we're talking about audited actuals, that we are in agreement between the district, our team of CPAs, external auditors, and the Marin County Office of Education. A question that I find that comes up often, because this is a continuous flow, right? It's a cycle that is just constantly shifting, is just noting that the original budget, it's just another way of looking at it, was passed before we started the fiscal year. Then, and I wrote BC, not before Christ, this is before Chris. So I just want to note that, right? Before Chris. So, I just made the connection, I'm not, yeah, just to make it clear. So the original budget was passed before I got here. So as you ask questions, please note that I am making observational commentary on district financials. Chris comes on board, and then I close the fiscal year prior, which is why what the board last saw was unaudited actuals being closed in August for the past fiscal year. So This original budget then, we're going to unaudited actuals. Then we secured our audit team. The audit occurred on the unaudited actuals. Here cometh first interim based on the budget year that we're in now. Now I am adjusting the budget from the prior year to first interim, and then cometh the forecast for the next two. That's the iterative cycle that happens. Yeah. So a little bit of, if you could afford me the opportunity, we have a new board member, so I just wanted to go through a quick explanation of the key revenue terms you're going to be hearing in this report, and also as a refresher for our board members as well. So we have unrestricted revenue. Okay? Unrestricted revenue is revenue that's defined as that which a school district can generally use for any educational purpose at its discretion without specific limitations. It is unrestricted. Examples of unrestricted revenue include property taxes, the largest component of the district's revenue, and a good chunk of our lottery funding. And I say good chunk because a portion of that needs to be allocated to instructional materials and supply. Restricted revenue, going across, includes revenue, as the name implies, with limitations imposed on how they can be used. This is set by the source of funding, a particular grant, kitchen infrastructure grants, for example, as the name implies. Some of our restricted revenue includes parcel taxes because it is voter approved. It cannot be used for administrative salaries, for example. There are restrictions associated. The foundation, again, there are stipulations regarding what the foundation is supporting, special ed grants, both from the state and federal governments, and title funding, specifically like Title I programs to support socioeconomically disadvantaged students from the federal government, restricted sources of funding. Let's go vertically now, right? You have unrestricted and restricted, but now you have ongoing versus one time, right? Ongoing, as far as we can tell, this is going to continue. But the way I define it is that in the budget for the next 3 years, is it ongoing? Yes, it is. Property taxes, ongoing. Lottery revenue, ongoing. On the restricted side, although parcel taxes have a timeline, 12 years was the original for the purposes in the budget because it covers all 3 years plus, we consider it ongoing. Foundation revenue, the assumption of ongoing funds. Special ed grants, again, passed by statute in some cases, so ongoing as well, and then title funding. Then we have the one-time. This is where the district received an influx of funding following the pandemic. COVID funding includes ESSER funding. Funding from the state of California was also included there. Instructional block grants came in from the state of California, and then things such as the Educator Effectiveness Grant, which is being utilized to support our professional development activities. But again, we can identify with intention there was revenue received that is not only restricted, it is one time, right? So what you'll see in this is you might see a bump in revenue, and we can point right to that it was one-time revenue that came in that fiscal year, and then has deadlines by which we must expend it. So the expenditures then come following that. Okay? In addition to revenue, you're going to see contributions. Property taxes that came in unrestricted gets then transferred into a restricted operation in two primary areas, special education and maintenance and operations. These, while there are some monetary supports, the vast majority of the district's special education and maintenance and operations must be funded by the district using funds that are received as unrestricted funds. So the district books a contribution in, but it also goes the other way, right? Parcel taxes now come in as restricted sources of revenue, okay, according to the Government Accounting Standards Board, because it is voter approved for a specific purpose. Parcel taxes come in to restricted. All of our salaries and benefits are in unrestricted, so then you're booking a contribution of revenue back the other direction. Okay, alternately, the district could move positions, but either way, it's a net contribution now, the other direction. Then we have, again, for our new board member, we have different funds. Fund 01 is the general fund, which, as the name implies, most of the district's operations are in there. All of our salaries and benefits, instruction materials, our educational programs, all the way down. Utilities, let's not forget about that, vendor contracts, student transportation, it is all in Fund 01. First interim certification is on Fund 01. But you're also certifying that all of the other funds have a positive cash balance. Another fund of importance is Fund 40, which covers our facilities outside of our core facilities. This includes the Granada property and the lease revenue that comes in to both maintain the site, so the tenant lease revenue comes in, the cost of facilities upkeep is booked in that fund, and then the net is transferred into the general fund as a transfer in, as a source of revenue in to the general fund to support the cost of administrative overhead. The people who are all in the general fund, right? So it's the tracking that cycle. And then, of course, Fund 13, because we are now talking about this with intention, and it will be impacted in the fund, we have the cost of the vendor contracts, we have the cost of materials and supplies, and then the district asks for reimbursement from state and federal sources. The money comes in, and ideally, we cover our costs. Okay, so those are the principal funds that we're talking about here. May I stop there and just ask if there are any questions at this point? Nope, okay. So going into the actual budget adjustments on revenue. Again, drawing your eyes, we have the revenue by category. We have our audited actuals, how we actually ended the year last year. We have how the budget for the current year had originally been passed. So if you're looking at this linear sequentially, rather in terms of timeline, the original budget happened first, the audit for the last year happened second, and then you have your first interim here, right? And so as an example, I'll start from the top. LCFF sources of revenue, that's our education protection account. It's a requirement by state law that requires that we set aside $200 times ADA. Then the revenue gets booked in from the state of California. That we are agreeing with the budget that was adopted, right? It is a little less than last year. Why? Again, you ask the why. Does that make reasonable sense? And yes, because our ADA dropped, right, from last year to this year. You can follow that, and so for every category, you're asking that assuming conversation. Does that make sense? I would agree that it does make sense. So we keep the budget pretty much in line, right, with how it was. Property taxes, here's another area that did adjust down, adjusted slightly down compared to the budget, but the budget was higher than last year. Does that make sense? Yes, because property tax growth rates increased in the current year. Why did we adjust it down? Because the budget for adoption was passed on the assumption of a 5.25% increase in the current year. The P1 update from Marin County's assessor's office received in November has it at 4.35% as of November. My assumptions have changed, right? At this point in time, I'm going to adjust the budget to have the budget reflect a 4.35% growth factor, so hence it's reflected there. Federal sources, hey, that's a drop. Last year, we ended at 466. We're now recommending a budget at 237. Why? Well, some of that funding that came in here was COVID one-time funding. So the money came in, and we probably have it in fund balance, right? We're accounting for that revenue not coming in, right? But we also know downstream, right, that we're gonna have to spend that money because there's a deadline by which to apply. State sources, here is an area where the district was under budgeted at budget for adoption. If you look at the 1.2 on state sources, this includes some one-time funding that came in the current year, including the anti-bias education grant. We're talking about Sam Drazen, Changing Perspectives, Trudy Arriaga. Those funding sources are a one-time grant that was being booked in the current fiscal year. So we're recognizing that revenue at first interim. There was also some under budgeting in ELOP and special education. We are also budgeting for the classified school employees assistance program because we know we are offering the program. We know the revenue is coming in. There will also be offsetting expenditures there. And then some state transportation revenue that was not included in the adopted budget. We are now including that as well because we know that's going to come in at a 65% reimbursement. So again, does it make reasonable sense? Am I making recommendations based on our current assumptions? This next topic, CalSTRS on behalf, has to do with revenue that we get from the state of California to offset pension costs, or some of those pension costs that the district incurs. And so this is continuing, and the reason it's highlighted is because this constitutes true pass-through revenue. The district does not recognize this in the sense that it is offset one for one as an expenditure entry in the expenditure table below. Parcel taxes, a slight adjustment. We trued up the number of secured parcels by the 3% inflation factor built into the parcel taxes. But there, we're carrying forward our $1.5 million revenue assumption from the foundation. That $79,000 there included the raise the paddle one-time funding source. Transportation on behalf, this was an interesting thing. This is part of that JPA that the district is part of along with the city of Tiburon, as well as Marin Pupil Transportation. The district receives revenue and then passes that revenue on to the transportation JPA. It is revenue in, however, right? And because it is being passed through, the district is recognizing the revenue, but we are correspondingly recognizing the expenditure down below. So you'll see a one-to-one adjustment there. Special education apportionments. This is one area that's based on the state COLA for the district. The district agrees with how we had budgeted at that point in time. Wrap it all together. There is a net change of 1.5, which represents just over 5% in revenue adjustments for the district's budget. Okay. Moving on to expenditures. Excuse me. Just like I did with revenue, some key terms for a new trustee as well. We have certificated employees. Those include teachers, our counselors, our psychologists, our speech therapists. We have classified employees that represents our instructional assistants, office managers, custodians, groundkeepers. And there are differing salary schedules that inform depending on which classification of employee you're in. Benefits, some key definitions here. We have statutory benefits, Social Security contributions, unemployment insurance, workers' comp, Medicare, all driven by percentages according to gross pay. Health benefits, employee only, employee plus one, and family. This, I might add, these rates are for the current calendar year. They will adjust, or rather the employee only will adjust starting January of 2025, I believe. Retirement references CalSTRS, that is the district's pension contributions, right, for our teachers and our educators. And then CalPERS, the public employee retirement system for all classified staff, two different pension systems. And then I'll go over this benefit section in a hypothetical example, which kind of gives insight into the district's costs when we look at the salaries and benefits. Books and supplies includes all instructional materials, curriculum, administrative supplies, but it also includes M&O supplies in there. Services and operating expenditures. Of course, we have utilities, insurance, networks, the physical infrastructure, legal costs, professional development, but it also includes non-public schools, non-public agencies, tuition that goes out to the Marin County Office of Education. I'm sorry, that's down here. Consulting and such as well, all vendor contracts. Capital outlay, you'll see this. Last year, there was a large capital outlay expenditure. This year, that budget was removed. That had to do with playground installation to our sites. And other outgo, that refers to tuition to the Marin County Office of Ed, so the tuition the district is paying. and any leases the district has, which in this district's case is all of our Apple leases. That, you've got it. Those are all of the key terms for the district's expenditures. So what changes did we do? Same kind of method that I approached revenue. So for certificated salaries, you'll note audited actuals is about 8.x% lower than it was booked, of course, because that represents the increase to the salary schedules in addition to step and column. We did make some slight adjustments based on our position control reconciliation. So we went into the system and looked at every single line item and just trued up and make sure that we were budgeting according to each individual's assignments. We did the same thing in classified. That one jumped a little bit more in terms of our first interim budget because we were adding special ed aides as well to the current year. So we made a plan, budget was adopted. We entered the year, and then we had to make adjustments based on the current reality of the needs of supporting our students. Employee benefits, I decided to kind of aggregate it out. The district's pension contributions, again, I mentioned it was about 19%. So again, that's the cost based on the salaries and benefits. It's not going to, for some of you who are going to pull out a calculator, it's not an exact 19% as a ratio here, because not all of the cost of salaries are pension eligible. Like for example, if you were to do a stipend, for example, it might not go into your STRS calculations for the year. Same thing with CalPERS, 27.05%, and that is increasing over time. CalPERS includes not only school employees, but community colleges, state of California, CSU, those are all within CalPERS as well, hence the costs are increasing at a greater rate than with CalSTRS. We have our statutory costs, which I'll go over on the next slide or in the couple slides here in terms of the additional driven cost to the district. And then OPEB liability, that has to do with the post-employment benefits for individuals who have retired, who have not reached Medicare eligibility. And then that has to do with the district's contribution to those plans as well. Again, there's the two offsetting entries, as I said, as the pass-through for transportation and for CalSTRS on behalf. Capital outlay, we did reduce it from the $728,000 down to $25,000 at first interim. Made a strategic recommendation to reduce that a little bit less because if there are additional expenditures related to capital outlay, I would recommend that we start moving it towards our capital facilities fund. And then other outgo, we kept it at the $450 based on the current contracts with the Marin County Office of Education, as well as the current lease agreements with Apple. That $450 is lower than the $679 because the $679 included prior year payments that was booked in that fiscal year. So I can tell I'm starting to lose people here, so I'm going to move on to the next slide, right? But the main thing is that the net change in expenditures over the original budget also is about 5%. So revenues went up a little bit more than 5%. The expenditure budget went up, I believe it was about 4.8% over the prior year budget. Here, in terms of books and supplies, just backing up, this includes a little bit lower than the $1 million that the district had actually realized the prior year. And the reason for that is this included some child nutrition expenditures because the Fund 13 was not created until after that. Hence, accounting for those expenditures moving out of the general fund, we're comfortable recommending that the budget stays relatively the same. And then in terms of services and operating expenditures, also an area where the district at budget for adoption budgeted low. If you look at all services and operating expenditures, the prior year was $3.4 million combined. Adopted budget had it at 2.6. We went through and looked at every category, increased utilities costs, gas, insurance, et cetera. When everything was said and done by category, it basically came back to what the budget was the prior year before that as well.
Do you mind if I ask a question before we move on?
Yes, of course.
And it's on that service and operating expenditures. I mean, obviously, we were way under budget. I guess I have two questions. One, do you know what was under budgeted? And the second follow-up question, I guess I'll ask that and then I'll.
Yeah, I predicted that would come up. So I aggregated out exactly by category where we are recommending budget increases in services and operating expenditures. So this is an extract of where we actually ended the year in 23-24. There's the original budget. This $3.4 million that we're recommending to the board to increase the budget in services and operating expenditures are across these categories. So utilities by itself was under budgeted by $115,000. Basically, the budget compared to the actuals that we had, right, in 23-24 was under by $115,000, and so we're increasing the budget to accommodate as well. M&O contracts by $168,550 based on the current assumed costs of repairs based on last year as well. Another area, special ed, non-public schools and agencies. Special ed is always a cost driver. Our analysis showed that we were under budgeted by $140,000 in that category.
Thank you, this is really helpful. So all of those adjustments are based on where we ended last year? On the actual audited final numbers?
Yeah, we started with that. We compared it to category. We looked at the budget in the current year, then looked at how we ended the year, and then asked ourselves, does this make sense? Like for utilities, as a group, of course, utilities costs are going to remain higher and just keep on increasing. And so then we did an analysis by each category.
So my second follow-up question is, I mean, you're basically flat, actually slightly down from where we ended last year. I mean, inflation is still a real driver. Do we feel comfortable that that number is high enough right now, or are we still under budget?
That's a great question to ask. We did our best with the analysis that we did at this point in time. We accounted for some of the movement out in services and operating expenditures into Fund 13, right? So some of that child nutrition cost was now moved out into Fund 13 as well. The district also did quite a lot in terms of maintenance and operations projects back in 23-24. That ties back to like again, this is the BC part before Chris.
Yeah, no, I understand
it was an analysis that the district's cost in terms of outside consulting and contracting fees was actually higher at that point in time. And so we're accounting for those costs now as well. To your point though, this is our best guess at this point in time, right? The district has a second interim coming in March that provides yet one more opportunity to look at our costs and go, whoa, okay, these costs are going a lot higher than we anticipated, and that's where I would be able to come to the board in March and go, hey board, at first interim you approved this, I need to make one adjustment in this line, for example. So I'll be able to justify why that budget adjustment is being made.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so before I go on, just one thing. I wanted to give a hypothetical example, or not even a hypothetical example. This is an example of the district's costs as it relates to salaries and the benefits. And this is for a new board member as well. So the total cost to the district when it accounts for, we'll start with gross salaries. And let's say this is based on BA plus 60 step 12, kind of in the middle of the certificated salary schedule. That cost is $123,149 on the salary schedule that goes into impact on January 1st, 2025. So that's how I'm tying that to, right? This is how we budget them. If that individual has an employee plus one for health and wellness coverage, okay? That is capped at $18,099 per year. I know the budget now based on whatever the salary is, based on that cap, based on what that individual signed up for. This is where Kathy comes in. Now we're looking at pension costs, right? Well, we know that the district's pension contribution, and this is not the employee's contribution, the employee out of their paycheck mandatorily puts in the 10.1% for this year. On top of that 10.1, the district now pushes in 19.1%. That is a cost to the district, right? Towards the pension system. And again, this is a certificated example. On the classified, this would be 27%. Then you have disability insurance, 0.5% on that. You have workers' comp that the district pays, 1.06% on that. Medicare, 1.45%, 1,007 on top of that. Package it all together, position control ties into the 174. So those budget adjustments based on our largest portion of our budget, which is people, is predicated on this model across the board for all of our employees. Okay. Tie it all together, right? If you tie it all together, and I'm just going to go from audited actuals, right? How we actually ended the year last year, again, audited, plus the first interim budget, because this budget with the revisions replaces the adopted budget, right? So audited actuals, 29 million in revenue, 29 million in expenditures. With the transfers in, the district had a change in fund balance of $1 million, adding to the district's fund balance. Going into that fiscal year, the district had, and this is combined unrestricted and restricted, by the way. I'll aggregate these out or segregate these out in a later slide. District had an audited beginning fund balance of 13.9. Add the million, the district had an ending fund balance of 14.2. This ending fund balance is our beginning fund balance for the current fiscal year. Whoa, it's off, right? It's off by $19,727. That was an audit adjustment, which I will be presenting the details on in January. But again, being able to explain how things are moving from one fiscal year to the other. With the budget adjustments at first interim, the district has basically a change in fund balance of break even, okay, of $13,799. Again, taking into account revenues in, expenditures, and then the contribution, the transfers in from the Granada lease revenue. And then that's what's adding to that 13.7, which basically keeps at first interim, the projection is that the district will break even in terms of its budget. Okay. Then that ending fund balance will pivot into a conversation regarding the components of the district's reserves. Now, just take a moment here. The reason why I highlighted this blue is because following this conversation in a couple agenda items will be a discussion regarding the board's policy regarding the district's reserve. Whatever the district provides in terms of direction will change this balance here in terms of the unappropriated category and move the equivalent dollar amount into the board designated category. That's basically how the math is going to work out. This 4%, this $1.2 million in the district's projection. Remember, this is our budget. It's our best guess estimate based on our assumptions, which hopefully I've shared with you with clarity. That's the 4% based on operating expenditures. And then the last component is restricted balances. And I think on your paper, I might have put it in a different order. My apologies there. But I wanted to go over what that restricted balance is. There's the 1.6 million in restricted funds. That is composed of these specific resources. As I mentioned, there are, of these $1.6 million in restricted balances, about half of them are ongoing in nature, title funds, for example, right? And the other half, about $700,000 of it, is one-time revenue that was received in the prior fiscal years. It is in our fund balance, and they have deadlines to expend. If the district doesn't expend it, right, in a program that is compliant, then the district has to book a payable back to the CDE. So I just want to plant that seed in terms of that's why you might see a revenue up and then an intentional spending of those resources down in the subsequent year or two. I'm going to stop there for a moment. So that brings us to the current year budget revisions. So So you take that and you start it in this column. This is our current year. Now, by statute, board must approve a 2-year forecast based on our current assumptions. Hopefully, I've done a good job of presenting why I brought forward these budget adjustments for the board's consideration. If the board were to approve the first interim, that's our starting point now for the current year. Our best guess estimate in the current year. Now you have a best guess estimate for the current year. Now we're going to provide a forecast for the next 2 years. What went into that forecast for 25-26 and 26-27? By the way, we have to do this again for second interim based on our new best guess estimates or new assumptions that have come at that point in time. In terms of revenue, that 4.35% property tax assumption continues at this point until we hear otherwise from the experts at the county. State COLA for community-funded districts, while property taxes are the largest source, hence this property tax growth rate is of an important consideration, our other state sources of revenue are still reliant on whatever the state COLA turns out to be. And the state COLA at this point in time, according to School Services of California and the Fiscal Crisis Management Action Team, is at 2.93% in this year, and then is projected to increase at 3.08%. So that will impact the state revenue in the out years. Parcel taxes, accounting, this one's easy, right? You have our current parcel increased by 3%, increased by 3%, according to how the voters approved that. Foundation revenue is being held flat for the MYP with current assumptions. Other local sources, this includes interest revenue based on cash held in the county treasury. This one is benching down, right? Just based on the current 10-year treasury forecast provided to us by the Marin County Office of Education. Special education apportionments also actually apply the state COLA if the state decides to apply the COLA to special education. That's another conversation altogether. So then that ties in the district's multi-year revenue projections, and those were the only factors that went into that at this point in time. With second interim, something changes, I'll bring it to the board's attention. For budget for adoption, if something changes, I will bring it to the board's attention as well and be able to identify why it is that we're doing so. Same thing, multi-year on the expenditure side. Our current first interim, if the board approves that, then we have 2 years of assumptions. In the district's multi-year, the factors that have gone into at this time include an average 3% step and column increase to the salary schedules. That is the average step and column across all of our salary schedules, okay? And then applying that 3% step and column to the subsequent years as well, okay? So again, as people increase in seniority by 1 year, they increase in step, right? And so the average step being 3%. There were also built in terms of addressing possible pre-K expansion based on enrollment in. The out years include an additional 1.0 FTE pre-K for certificated, the teacher, and the corresponding instructional aid in that classroom as well. CalSTRS, maintaining that increase at 19%. It's not that it's increasing at 19, it's that it is 19%. That percentage increases because this percentage has this dollar amount has increased. Same thing happens for CalPERS, books and supplies, and for services and operating expenditures. For the purpose of the multi-year, we just benched it according to the projected consumer price index. Then when we get into budget for adoption, we'll be more tactical about evaluating those needs one by one. So then that picks all of our expenditures together. You tie that together.
I'm sorry, can I
Yes, please.
pause? On the forecast for 25, 26, and 26, 27, we are just budgeting the 3% step and column. We're not budgeting any salary increases because we haven't agreed to them, correct? Or
That
we
is
haven't
absolutely
negotiated them.
correct.
Okay.
So the point at which the district would budget that in would be following an AB 1200 process. It's an assembly bill that dictates how the district is publicly disclosing the cost of collective bargaining and then budgeting for that cost of collective bargaining in the following financial presentation. So this does not include the cost of collective bargaining for 25-26.
Okay.
Okay.
So this is just straight step and column.
Yes, it is just straight step and column at this point in time.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Can I just ask a clarifying
Yeah,
question?
of course.
So I think you've asked it, but I just want to make sure I fully understand. So that doesn't include any raises, but if there was no raises, there'd still be a 3% increase in
Yeah,
salary?
so if you're defining raises as an increase to the salary schedule, right? So you're applying an increase to the salary schedule. So every step is increasing by a certain percentage. That would be above and beyond what we are budgeting in 25-26 and 26-27. So this only includes the built-in step and column increases. So if the district does, let's say we're in a situation where nothing more was given, then what we're still budgeting for is increasing costs in salary expenditures.
Okay, thank you.
Are you okay if I ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay. I know we have a couple of curriculum adoptions coming in, and so would we expect books and supplies, I would assume, to go up? You're just not, you're just showing us if we took this interim and applied it out 2 years, but for example.
Oh, thank you for pointing that out.
Okay.
I appreciate it. Yes, this is more than a 3% on that. This does include the curriculum adoption.
Okay.
Yeah,
For both.
thank you.
Is there one that you're in
Yeah,
next
the
year?
way that I applied it is I increased the budget by $150,000 in 25-26 and by another $150,000 in 26-27, and then increased that by the 3%.
And when you adopt a curriculum, do you spread it out over the lifetime of the curriculum, or is it all go in that first year?
I have an expert who can answer that question right here. Sorry, you're passing them back. Curriculum adoption, yeah, so that's.
There's often options with curriculum adoptions, how you pay for them. So often it will be probably a conversation between me and Chris of what makes sense for us in terms of where our budget is. But sometimes you can pay out for 7 years that you're adopting, and you're just telling them numbers. And then we have that happening right now with a few of our curriculums. Sometimes it's an annual, so it really is going to be to look at probably our budget, where we're standing, of which one we like to use and then better deals. There's all those kind of things that will go into consideration with the curriculum.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Nicole. Appreciate that. Okay, and so that ties up on the expenditure side, are the factors that went into the multi-year forecast at this point in time. You tie that in together again, right? So again, with the interim budget, this goes down to that ending fund balance based on the budget adjustments to revenue, budget adjustments to expenditures. Carry that forward into the forecast. Again, ending balance turns into the starting balance. You take the change in fund balance based on the revenue assumptions and the expenditure assumptions, and then that gives us the ending balance forecast for next year. You take that, move it into 26-27. You apply the same methodology based on the assumptions, and then it lands you with the 2-year ending forecast with the assumptions we have at this time. And so with that said, basically the district's ending balance stays, relatively stable going through the next 2 out years as well. Notice though, and this is an important point, I started with that restricted fund balance, right? Have at 1.6 at first interim. Notice how the restricted balance is decreasing, right? The district is intentionally planning to spend down its restricted fund balance because again, we don't spend it, we return it in many cases as well. This would be an area where curriculum adoption would play in because some of those restricted fund balances are very much in the domain of curriculum, right? And then the state 4% is again shifting based on the cost of our operations. So 4% based on total operating costs will of course be a moving and nebulous thing. What I mean by that is the number will change, although the percentage is remaining at 4%. And again, leaving the board policy designation cleared out for the time being, following board direction regarding district reserves, the unappropriated balance will shift into the board policy designation category following each category at that point in time.
So can I just clarify? I just want to make sure. So our ending balance for each year looks like, but it goes down slightly in 25, 26, and then it goes back up in 26, 27. But if I look at our unassigned, unappropriated, which is our basically our unrestricted fund balance, it does look like it goes up 100,000 in 25, 26, and then up a little bit more. So like that one is staying pretty even.
Yeah, it has to do because this combines our unrestricted and our restricted. And
Okay.
I thought you might ask that, which is why I included a breakout of both.
Okay, I jumped ahead, sorry.
So on the unrestricted side, this is just the unrestricted part of the house. This is just a restricted fund balance side of the house. Again, starting in the current budget year, next to, current budget year, next to, right? And so what you're seeing is a combination of factors. One, you're seeing that the district's unrestricted fund balance, and here's an important caveat again, this does not include future collective bargaining, right? And changes to the salary schedules outside of step and column. With that said, with current assumptions, the district in unrestricted funds shows that it is balanced, right? And even adding just a bit, right? In restricted, however, because again, those funds came in, right? And we know we need to utilize them, you're seeing an intentional spend down of that on the restricted side, right? So the combination of the two is what's causing that $13,000 carry forward. The combination of the two is what's causing the one, I believe, combined $115,000, yep, $141,000 figure here. And the combination of the two is what's causing a slight increase in the multi-year out. So it's an important thing to keep in mind.
Thank you for breaking this out.
Okay, moving on, cash flow. The district is meeting its cash requirements for the fiscal year. The dark blue is cash that was realized, fund balance. You'll note, Sandeep, that the district obviously receives apportionments of property tax revenue starting in July, again in December, and again in April, right? And so the district's costs continue down, tracking down its cash balance, comes back up, tracking down its cash balance. Next property tax revenue apportionment happens, tracks down to a projected ending cash balance of $14,092,000. That is slightly different than the fund balance because this cash balance has to do with accounting for accounts receivable, accounts payable on the balance sheet side coming in. But once those are received, then the budget informs that for the year. We're almost there. Thank you for your stamina through all of this. Okay. Outside of the general fund, key funds include Fund 13, that is the Child Nutrition Fund. We have a deferred maintenance fund, which ties into slight transfers out of the general fund as well. I will come back to you for second interim with far more knowledge about Fund 14, because this one is new to me with this district. But as you can see, the dollar amounts in that fund are quite minor. Fund 25 accounts for the district's developer fee revenue. That's if an individual is adding square footage to their property, then a portion of the impact fees get paid to the elementary school. So those funds are housed in Fund 25. And then the aforementioned Granada property, the lease revenue that's received from the preschools at that site are deposited into Fund 40. Again, going back to that example, we are currently budgeted for $872,000 in terms of lease revenue from the Granada site. We're budgeted at $392,000 for upkeep, right, of that site. That leaves $480,000, and of that, $470,000 is being transferred in back to the general fund as a transfer in, as we alluded to before, to offset the cost of administration, specifically for M&O staff. I want to be clear on that, okay, not for anyone outside of M&O.
Can I ask a question about Fund 40?
Yes, of course.
Because we're operating more like a typical landlord on Fund 40 versus, quote, a school district, because that's what we are. Normally, if you're running a commercial landlord, you're going to reserve 5 to 10% of your lease revenue for CapEx. It looks like we're basically, our change in fund balance would be 10,000. That's kind of like our CapEx reserve. It's way under 5 to 10%. Is that, like, why are we so low there, and should we be holding more?
Thank you for bringing that up. I believe there's an opportunity to retain more of the district's revenue in leases, but I might add the reason why, one idea that we've been thinking about is that the lease revenue is increasing for many of our tenants starting in this next calendar year based on the consumer price index that's built into their month-to-month leases currently. And so as we rebench and re-budget the revenue with those leases, that would provide an opportunity to increase the amount kept. Another also thought is that that fund also has a sizable fund balance at this point in time. And so those funds are intended to be utilized for district facilities upkeep as it is. So that's just another perspective. But something that we can do further analysis on and bring forward to the board for recommendations into the future.
Just reading the numbers, is it fair assumption that 470,000 that we transferred out is 100% being utilized by M&O staff? There's nothing else left on the other side?
On the other side being in the general fund? No, it's actually far more than that. So the district's maintenance and operation budget, if extrapolated at first interim, is actually about $1.25 million. So this 470 is only offsetting just a portion of it as well. Mm-hmm. And districts are required by statute to put at least 3% of its general fund operating budget into M&O. So that 1.2 represents quite a bit more than the 3%, and that 470 is meant to offset those costs as well, but again, not offset all of it. Okay, that brings me to the end in terms of the presentation. So what are next steps, right? So again, going back to that school budget cycle, I'm presenting the first interim recommended budget adjustments for the current fiscal year, which informs the multi-year, out 2 years, the forecast. In January of 2025, I'll be bringing forward the post-employment retirement OPEB benefits actuarial study that was completed, where we'll talk about the district's liability for retirement benefits. I'll also present the district's audit findings, which again, the financials were integrated into first interim, but I'll be presenting the statutory findings now in terms of the prior fiscal year. Then going into February, in alignment with my colleagues on the ed side of the house, we'll be presenting the LCAP mid-year update. Then going into March, I will be doing one more interim, which again takes into account any additional budgetary assumptions that have come to my knowledge. My goal is to be able to tie those adjustments directly to the facts as to apply. And any questions?
Dr. Kim, thank you so very much. That was incredibly thorough and very well explained. Are there any questions from the board?
I have sort of a general overarching global question here, which is last year we had a budget and we got to the end of the year and like that budget was showing us that we were like going to be like, and I apologize because all of this is pre-Chris. There was a budget that showed, I believe that we were going to be close to $1 million in deficit spend, and we ended up $1 million on the positive. So it was like almost a $2 million swing. So obviously we want to avoid that again. That's not great. And I know that a lot of this is projections. Do you have any understanding as to what happened last year and like how we can avoid that this year?
Where I can speak with certainty, given the before Chris.
Obviously,
comment.
and I know I'm asking you to talk historically about things you don't.
Sure. Where I can point with, I'll start here, right? We have our audited actuals where the district closed its books in actuality in 23, 24. And the first part of your question was we closed $1 million over. We added to the fund balance. Right? So in regards to that specifically first, I would point to probably that a large part of that has to do with the restricted revenues that are being received one time ahead of time, right? So you get those revenues and you don't have the offsetting expenditures yet, right? Then what that would show is you're increasing your revenue, right? And not having the expenditures hit the books yet. That's likely one factor. Other factors is when districts pass a budget, they're making best guess estimates, and that budget may not come to fruition in terms of actual expenditures as well, right? So you might have budgeted for a position, let's say, and I can't speak to what that might have been in the past year, but if you budgeted for a position because at the time you were truly expecting that you had an additional position or an expectation of such, and then because life happens, you don't fill that position, then that also creates a gap in terms of what you thought you would be ending the year versus how you ended the year. Then the other part of the equation is, I believe for the budget for adoption, again, going back to the revenue sources, it's where we were identifying things where, in essence, I believe the district might have thought, or actually just looking at local transportation on behalf, for example, the district that budget for adoption did not budget the local transportation, right? Because one idea is that revenue that's coming in through local transportation is just going to be moved right out, right? As an expenditure passing through to the JPA. Well, that alone would account for $471,000 in under budgeting of revenue. What I'm trying to do is reduce the variances between the budget and actuals by saying, I know it's passed through, right? But I'm going to budget the revenue at first interim, right? And then I'm also going to budget the expenditures, even though I know it's coming through and going out, right? So if you were looking just at the revenue side, then this category by itself would have caused a $471,000 swing in terms of how the district had budgeted revenue. So as with many things, there's probably a combination of multiple factors, but again, that's just through my observational lens.
Yeah, so also on local sources, I see a big swing.
Yeah, so let me draw my eyes. So local sources, this 757 includes the district's interest revenue on cash held in the county treasury. Just like when you as a household keep money, let's say in a savings account or a checking account, it generates minor interest, and that's just high yield, right? Same with the district. The district's cash that is held in the county treasury generates interest revenue. This is one category where the district was under budgeted, right? So we are budgeting for the assumption of that interest revenue, taking into account the 10-year yield on treasury. And then the local cash clearing account, that actually has to do with when districts are receiving abatements on the Granada property or other cash that comes in as a refund, for example. Those are categories that are essentially abating expenditures, but it's still coming in as revenue because it's a check back to us. So again, I'm also accounting for those costs, best projection, again in an interest to reduce the variances, right? I'm recognizing revenue while offsetting the expenditures.
Okay, so that one by itself looks like it's like 400,000-ish, just the interest that wasn't accounted for before.
Yeah.
Okay.
And again, other factors as well that go into that. And again, there will be opportunities to keep on iteratively readjusting because budgets are a living document, right? But the goal is to be able to explain those changes as we get there as a community. Yes.
So I believe we had applied for the JPA reimbursement, but weren't sure that it was going to work.
Okay, so that's.
When we worked on well, I would think we would have known by second interim, but I can't remember. Do you remember, Kim, when that came through?
I don't remember exact timing, but
It was
I do
sometime
think to Chris's
spring.
point that it is a pass-through and that it's similar to CalSTRS, that we know there's revenue coming in, and then he has it marked again on the expenses, but.
So that would have been like another $500,000. So right there, between those two, you've gotten basically $1 million swing. Okay, and we're trying to account for those now. Okay, thank you, that's helpful.
My idea on this is more performance mastery, and here we're spending it so well. Just taking on Shelby's point, I mean, you've done a really good job explaining things. Now, coming from the outside and not being here in the past few very great processes, is there some sort of margin of error within which you work? So, fine, you can explain things, but going forward, when we talk about variances, what is normal and what is abnormal?
That's a really good point. I always start by asking myself, if my household budget at the end of the year was off by 5%, would I be really upset with myself, right? And you're probably looking at me going like, dude, based on what you're showing me, you probably would, right? But in reality, that's how I think about it, is what I'm showing is a 5%, after all of this, I'm showing a 5% budget adjustment in revenue and a 5% budget adjustment in expenditures. What I'm trying to do is explain that to set the foundation for as we move forward, because I've only been here 4 months, I have another opportunity to adjust the budget in March. As long as I can communicate that coherently to the community and to the board, even if there is more than a 5% change, right, at least I will be able to advise why it happened, right? And that's my hope, is that I can't account for a 5% or a 10% because life happens. Look what happened during the pandemic. There's no way to project that, right? And so the playground equipment, for example, there are various other factors. We've had massive storm surges come in. Eduardo can come back to me tomorrow and go, Bel Air is now flooded, right? We just have a massive thing that we cannot account for, but I should be able to then bring to the board and the community as to, right? So that's the goal, I think, and I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Are there any other questions before we move on? Okay, so is there public comment on this item? I will recognize Shay O'Brien. You have 3 minutes.
Sorry, I said I would do this. I know that Dr. Kim will respond to my comments. I just wanted to kind of share a little bit of my perspective. When Dr. Kim was kind of going over the salary numbers there, it seems to me, if I understood correctly, that those numbers are based off of the assumption that salaries are increasing due to progression along the salary schedule without a increase to those numbers due to collective bargaining. So I just wanted to bring up the point that my assumption would be that those projections are also not including potential retirement of veteran teachers as well. We have a pretty, I don't want to say top-heavy, but veteran teacher population. Looking at our current distribution of full-time assignments, right now we have about, according to the numbers that I was given by Dr. Kim, 18.9 full-time employment assignments that are in the supermax position, set 25 and all the way on BA plus 75 column. So with those teachers having served 25 years, having just spoken with our unit members, a lot of them are looking at retirement in the next couple of years or so. So I see an opportunity potentially for the district to offer maybe some sort of golden handshake or retirement incentive. And my understanding of that is that you can be a little kind of creative, a little flexible in what kind of package you offer. But if you were able to get of those, 18.9, let's say you get about half of them or so willing to take that deal, say 10 teachers. Right now, our supermax earners are earning about $143K per year. And then you're replacing those teachers with a new hire earning, I think our entry-level salary is $75,000. That's a savings to the district of about $75,000 per person. Again, if you get 10 teachers who's going to take that deal, that's maybe $750,000. With a 1% salary increase estimated at a district cost of $119,000, that translates to roughly about a 7% salary increase for the teachers remaining on salary schedule. So I just noticed, we're going over the numbers, it looks like the district really kind of sitting flat in the projections for the next few years. But I kind of get the feeling the board is starting to get into a little bit of a conservative posture around salaries and upcoming collective bargaining. So I just wanted to just kind of air that alternative perspective and say, there are creative solutions here. I think we have that would work in the benefit of the long-term stability, financial stability of the district, but also the financial stability of the professionals who serve it.
Thank you. Thank you. Is there any other public comment? All right, deliberation by the board on this topic.
Just huge thanks to Dr. Kim. Very thorough, very clear.
Thank you. Excellent. So seeing deliberation is done, is there a motion to approve the first interim financial report for the 2024-25 year?
With a positive.
With a positive certification.
So moved.
Is there a second? Sandeep? All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, thank you. P2, presentation of the initial interests of the Reed Union School District for negotiation with the Reed District Teachers Association, RDTA. Dr.
Great.
McGrath?
I would suggest today that we accept the sunshine that the RDTA put forward, and then we also have the articles that we would suggest putting forward on our behalf as well, which includes calendars, evaluations, language in Article 13, and total compensation.
Okay.
We'll look for action on that today.
Are there any questions for Dr. McGrath? Okay, is there any public comment? There will be also a public hearing, so you can speak on it then. Okay, board deliberation on this? Okay. Good. Is there a motion to approve the initial interests of the Reed Union School District as presented?
I'll move to accept the initial interests of the Reed Union School District as presented.
Thank you. And Liz will second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay. So moving on to P3, the board organizational meeting for 2025. So at this meeting, we do this annually, the governing board, this is based on our governance handbook and our board policies. The governing board shall elect a president from among its members to provide leadership on behalf of the governance team and the educational community it serves. The governing board shall also elect a vice president and a clerk from its own membership. So historically, our board rotates through the various leadership positions, clerk, moving on to vice president, moving on to president. This system allows each board member the opportunity to serve as president if they choose to do so. I would like to start with the nomination and voting process for our board president. We'll do that, and then we'll move on to vice president and clerk. Is there any questions or comments that we want to have before we go into the nomination process? Okay, so it has been an absolute privilege to serve as board president this year. Our current vice president is Sherry Wingenheim. And I think I'm just going to take it from myself because I have the utmost respect for Sherry. I would like to nominate Sherry to be next terms board president. Is there a second? Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
All right. Congratulations. We will move on to the nomination process for our vice president. Our current vice president, excuse me, our current clerk is Shelby. Sorry, the SH names are very hard for me. Is there a nomination?
I would like to nominate Shelby for vice president.
Excellent. And I would like to second that. So all those in favor?
Aye.
And then moving on to clerk. That is a position that if you take, you are kind of go into the process again of VP and president. Is there a nomination for clerk?
I would like to nominate Elizabeth.
Excellent. Is there a second?
I'll second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. So do we have, is that sufficient? Do we roll call? Good. All right. Thank you very much. Moving on to P4, the appointment of superintendent as secretary to the Board of Trustees. This is not an item that we vote on, but it is in our governance handbook and our board policy that the governing board shall appoint the superintendent to serve as secretary for the board.
It says it's an action item. We don't have to
Yeah,
vote.
I think it is.
Is it an action item? It is an action item. Excuse me. Thank you. Is there a motion to appoint our superintendent, Kim McGrath, Dr. McGrath, as secretary to the Board of Trustees?
So moved.
A second?
I'll second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, Shelby, for catching that. Okay, P5, board representation to district and community organizations for 2025. This is the item that is just discussion only. We do not vote on this. We have, thanks Keith for putting that up. Dr. McGrath, do you want to lead this?
Great, happy to. So if you look at the top, Keith will fill in the board officers there, and then you will notice starting below that, we intentionally do not take action on this, otherwise each of these committees would need to follow the Brown Act. But we would love ideas and your ability to serve on these. So let's start with, at the top, we have the strategic plan would be Liz and Sherry. Would you like to keep it that way?
Makes sense to me.
Great. Are we okay with that? Then goal 1 would be Afsane and Sherry. That work?
That works.
Okay. Next would be social emotional learning. So we would have Afsane there. And do we have someone that would be willing to take Jacqueline's spot?
So in this scenario, I don't know if we want to move around or stick with what we've been on, or introduce the opportunity for Sandeep if you have particular ones you're interested in. But
Yeah, I feel like we should talk about, because we lost in your gaming, like I feel like people should talk about like what they're most interested in so that we make sure that they're working. I will say, I think for strategic plan, leaving Liz and Sherry makes the most sense since they helped develop it. But it seems like for our goals, it makes sense for everyone to sort of talk about what they're most interested in so that we all end up in places that make sense.
yeah, or potentially moving, so for example, I don't know if we need to go linear here, but I'm on staff and finance, and I can certainly stay or move. Since Jacqueline is moving off of staff, then I'm happy to stay with continuity, but I don't need to stay with finance unless Sherry wants to move, or if Sandeep, you want to join. But I would say if you want any position here, you just let one of us know, and we can adjust.
What would be your main interest, Sandeep, of those?
I was listening to the lunch part, and I was really interested in that. So that's one option. Otherwise, honestly, plug me in wherever you need me. I'm going to be a team player on this, and then I'll have a more a better point of view next time. If I get worked.
I will make a comment on goal 5 for facilities. I think right now it might be wise to keep myself and Shelby on just because there was we've kind of have all that background knowledge, and it would be, I think, helpful for reporting out to have that, but that's just something to comment on.
I agree. I think
Yeah.
that continuity makes sense.
I would also suggest to the point that Liz raised, like places where Jacqueline's dropping off, if you were on with Jacqueline, I feel like it would be good to stay, just to have some a through a line of one person who has historical knowledge. Not to lock you all in on those, but that's also locking me in on one.
I don't mind transitioning off finance and onto health and wellness with Opsine.
Okay.
So that leaves something open.
So that'll be Opsine and Liz.
And if Sandeep wants universal lunch, she can take my spot.
Great.
Okay.
Well, one thought I would say is that I do think that facilities and finance are going to have some overlap going forward. So it might make sense for Opsine or I to move to finance, just because I do think that if we are looking at a bond, there could be overlap between those two.
Shelby, are you interested in finance?
I can do finance. It's not my background, but I'm happy to jump in on it.
But someone with
So
snapping.
that's happened on safety then for you? If you, would you want to get off of that?
Sure, if you wanted to take safety, that would be great. Safety is a great way to get to deepen in what's going on a lot of the campuses.
Great. So safety would be Opsine Sandeep. Finance would be Sherry Shelby. We
Facilities
have
remain.
facilities set.
So now we have.
Community and families would be Shelby and,
I'm happy to jump in on that too.
and Liz, great. And then staff would be Liz and
I can take
Sandeep. Thank you. And then we have universal lunch would be Shelby and Sandeep. With health and wellness, Opsine and Liz. SEL seems like the only remaining, Opsine and,
It kind of seems like those go hand in hand, social, emotional, and health and wellness, or no?
mhm.
Because I'm
They
happy
are kind
to
of
take that on too.
subsets, yeah. So can I put you there, Liz? Is that okay? And SEL? Okay, thank you. Okay, great. So then let's go down to JLAC. We did have Jacqueline with Sherry as the backup. Sherry, are you okay staying for JLAC?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm good with that.
So Sherry's the primary, then we would need a backup for JLAC.
I'm very interested in JLAC, so I'm happy.
Okay, great. So Shelby
that.
can be the backup. And then MCSBA.
So I've been
Yeah, I was going to say,
kind of
you
been
did
doing
it.
that. So I could move, if Sherry would like to be the main as board president, but then I would happily be backup because, what are your
Or we could
thoughts on
do vice versa.
that? Or how
I can
about
be the
that?
backup if Liz doesn't want to be the backup anymore. I have to jump off of JPA because I cannot make the meetings. So just a
Great.
heads up on that. There
So-
won't be any overlap on that.
So MCSBA would be Opsine as primary, Sherry as the backup.
Is that okay with you?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then E2,
I would like to stay on just because I feel like we're starting to get going. But if someone would be very interested in taking it, I can be backup just to have that experience. But we should have a backup just.
I'll stay as backup.
Perfect.
And
so Opsine and Liz is backup,
Yes.
great. Okay, then foundation, we have Shelby. You okay with that, Shelby?
Sure.
And then do we have a backup for Shelby?
I can get it back.
Great, Sandeep? Thank you. District PTA, Liz, are you okay with that? Yep. Great, and then do we have a backup?
Sandeep, are you interested in that or is that too much? They're pretty regular meetings. It just might be a nice opportunity to get to know a lot of community members. Don't want to push you in there.
I can do backup on that.
Okay.
It's just that 8:30 is drop off for the little one.
Yeah.
I'll put you as backup, and then typically Liz will be there.
it's only fine.
Belvedere City Council, stay as Opsine?
I will, but I feel guilty. I have not done nothing with them, but I will stay.
I'm in the same boat with Tiburon Town Council.
And coordinator.
Yeah, I think we need to be voluntold of what we're supposed to address.
Well, I don't know that they really want to hear from us, but they may need to upcoming.
It'll become important if we do a bond.
That's what I'm saying, upcoming, it might become a real thing.
Okay. And do you feel that we would have to have a backup since it's
I don't
not
think
very
so.
frequent? How about
I
we
don't
take the
think so.
backup off those
Yeah.
three? Okay.
Yeah, I think that the last we spoke of this, it was a similar scenario where we thought if we were requested to do some sort of RUSD update or presentation, we would jump, be
That's who we
very
would go
present
to.
and
Okay.
able to do so, but we haven't.
But now
It's
that,
unclear when we should be attending and what their, what that relationship would be.
Okay.
now that she's put together the presentation on the kind of, who we are and what
Yeah.
we are, that was one of the things we talked about in our advocacy, was going out and being a little bit more, so that would be one of the things that we had discussed at our, was it the governance workshop last year?
Yeah, and I think
Be
maybe
more
that's,
proactive.
Good idea.
yeah, something we could talk about.
But I don't think it requires backups either way.
I think it's probably one time a year,
Sounds good.
unless they ask for more.
Yellow Bus JPA then, Sherry, that doesn't work for you.
Yeah,
And
I
then
haven't been able
Jacqueline's
to go
off.
to a
Is-
meeting. It's on
Is it every Wednesday?
Tuesday, no, it's Tuesday mornings at 10 o'clock.
Okay, let me, I'll check.
Tuesday.
Super convenient time. Tuesday at 10.
That's
Every, or
It's
once a month?
basically once a month, and sometimes it's once every other month, but
Okay.
I have a standing staff meeting, I can't move.
I think Tuesdays are generally
Tuesday
pretty
morning.
open for me, so I can do it if no one else is interested.
Do we? I
Do we
think
need
have
to?
have two,
We
but
do have to have
our
two.
superintendent can serve as,
I can
as-
be a backup.
can be a backup, but I think we're supposed to have two representatives at the meeting.
So I will take one.
Since I have the ranch, JP, I feel that maybe I should stay with the ranch, but if you want me to be your other, I can do it.
Yeah.
Liz or Offset, yeah? Is that,
Or Sandeep, do you want to do? Oh, you can't do 10 o'clock, okay.
Then include me on
Liz? Okay, so
Yeah.
Shelby and Liz. And then we
Safer Out
have,
to Schools doesn't really need anyone, and it definitely doesn't need a backup.
could I?
There's
remove-
enough administrative people on that call that I'm not sure I'm adding a ton of value, except the only thing is, they do send me their meeting minutes, so if there was something relevant, I could at least flag it. So
Okay.
I don't think it requires a backup, though.
Okay. So you're willing to say that would just be receiving the information?
I'm
and-
perfectly happy to continue to
Perfect.
receive it.
I think Mr. Send it along, okay. The ranch, then Liz, does that work for you to stay?
It does.
I can be your backup,
Okay.
because
Okay.
I don't mind doing that.
I can take any backups from the evening that's left
Okay.
first.
Rotary, that would just be me letting you know if you're needed there.
That's good.
And so I think if we leave it like that, it's just fine. I don't think it's very likely. And Belteb Library.
Shelby, are you okay?
First or second, whatever you need.
If Sandeep wants to do that one, again, that's one that they haven't asked for anything, and I don't even know, but it might be a good one if we're going out to the city councils to do it too. But yeah, if you want to take that one, why don't you do it?
Sounds good. And then you're saying no backup needed.
I can stay as backup if that's helpful, but I don't know that there's backup needed,
Okay.
given that it's not happened.
Okay, and just a reminder, all trustees participate in policy review, district goals, program evaluation, governance workshops, curriculum, and school visitations. All right, and so is there any questions?
I do have a question about just process around this. So when you have meetings that are related to these topics, do you go to the sort of strategic planning representatives first, or do you bring it to the whole board and then? Because I feel like if we're looking for these people to become more expertises in areas, it might be helpful to sort of ask the people who are assigned to them first,
Yeah.
and then if those people aren't available, then bring it out
For
to the
sure.
whole board.
Yeah, for sure. That should be the pattern. And I
Okay.
think I've messed it up, like with food service. I think I did maybe throw it out to everyone instead of going to the list.
Okay.
So that's, if I did go out to the full list, it was just my mistake. Yeah.
Okay.
But I think
But
I
that
was
is
the
the
one who went, so it
Right.
worked.
It did work out that way because that's, the people said, that's me. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so any other questions? Is there public comment on this? Any board deliberation? Okay, so Keith, you have all the changes.
Yes, we came in on
Okay.
it, we'll make sure.
You got it.
Excellent. P6, adoption of the 2025-26 governing board meeting calendar.
Great. Want me to dive in? Yeah, so would love to look at adopting these dates. You can note that Keith put a lot of detail there about the things that he looked for, due dates or things we needed to avoid, et cetera. Also looked at major religious holidays to make sure we avoided them. You'll notice that there is a built-in study session at the beginning of September. Since I've been here, we've always wanted one in August or September. And instead of trying to look for, dates, I think it'd be better to have it there and not need it, instead of vice versa. And then you'll notice the governance workshop set for January. Otherwise, it's regular board meetings, just like this one, a Monday, because of that financial deadline for Ms. Dr. Kim. Any questions or concerns about any of the dates?
June 9th, 2026, two of us have kids graduating high school that day.
Oh, fun. So
So is there any possibility of moving it like to Wednesday
Or Monday.
or Monday?
Monday. I would advocate for Monday just to be consistent with Mondays.
Yeah, Monday
one
would be
Monday.
fine. Either one. It's just, I don't know if we need a full week or what our deadlines are.
That one's tricky
Oh, yeah.
because it has that 1 week. Do we have
That's
to have a
right.
week in between when we present and then accept? There's something funky about
with
GA.
LCAP, right?
Yeah, there's something weird about that
Wednesday's
one.
fine.
But
I mean,
does it have to be
I'm
Monday?
thinking-
Is it 7 days or is it 6 days?
So if we have the previous one on the 2nd,
So we would move the second, we would move the first one as well.
I don't believe. I think on the 8th, it may work. If we did that one on June 8th. Can we tentatively say June 8th, and then if we see a scheduling or a requirement conflict, we'll come back? Does that sound good?
I could be wrong, but I think June 8th is a Sunday.
On the 2026. I
Oh,
think it's a Monday.
2026.
Yeah.
I'm
Not graduating
traveling
this
in
year,
time.
graduating next year.
Okay. Okay, so we'll say June 8th unless we were double checking deadlines and
Yeah,
or requirements, so we can't do that.
I think either works.
Wait, so you want to be at your child's senior year graduation and not be at this board meeting?
That means Liz would be running. Oh, no, we don't even know who would be running. We need to be running.
Okay. So do you
Well, and
want,
if somebody else was sick, then we wouldn't have a quorum.
Exactly. Can we approve that with this change, or we
with
have
the
to bring it back?
suggested changes of June 8th?
Okay, so wait, are there any questions? Is there any public comment? Board deliberation? Okay, so is there a motion to approve the adoption of the 2025-26 board meeting calendar with the potential of moving the June 9th, 2026 date to June 8th, 2026? Is there a motion?
I will make that motion.
Is there a second, Liz? Or second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay. P7, the approval of the resolution number 3, 2024-25, authorization to sign on behalf of the board for 2025.
Just looking for action on this for signatures to be updated.
Motion, Paul, second.
Do I have to do?
Liz and Sherry.
Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Excellent. P9,
8.
sorry, excuse me. Thank you, everyone. Update to administrative and authorized signers for our Wells Fargo clearing accounts.
Great. Again, just looking for actions to update the names.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Now P9, the first reading of our revised board policies to align with CSBA standards. We have 11 board policies and a reserve policy update.
And Officer, may I suggest we do the reserve policy first?
Yes, please.
Are you sure you don't want to hear us talk about all of these? Thank you, Mr. Smalls, for being here.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Jeff Small, Capital PFG. This is our fourth meeting, actually. We made a ton of progress on a reserve policy, and we can go to the next slide. One of the things that was very important to the district was to have a reserve policy that was very objective, transparent to the public, looking at legal requirements of, what the state would require a reserve, and that's 4%. Looking at the California Department of Education, what they would recommend for a basic aid community district, that's 50%. And I think we really dug down in evaluating the vulnerabilities and risk analysis for the district. And that was, spent a lot of time looking at what happens if there's a 6.7 earthquake. There's one expected over the next 30 years, and lo and behold, on Saturday night, I'm in my bed in Granite Bay, which is outside of Roseville, and we don't have earthquakes here. And I wake up and I'm like, oh my God, is that an earthquake? Sure enough, it's not. Of course, I don't know if you all felt it, but if we look at earthquakes, we look at fires. Fire risk would be very important. One of the things that we noted was Marquette, very similar school district, had a 12.5% loss of their tax base. Very devastating. So we started looking at these potential catastrophic losses and said, well, what would happen if that happened to our tax base? And it's not just, if you recall, it's not just the loss. It's the loss of the growth in the tax base. And we went back and looked over 25 years, your growth rate was at 6%, which is pretty high. So, if you're down 12.5%, go add another 6% to that, and tax bases don't necessarily recover right away. So these are just some of the things we looked at. We looked at economic downturn, we looked at the Great Recession, saw that there was a hit taken to the tax base. We looked at some of these other vulnerabilities, whether it be to community-funded districts and categorical funds, or the potential for liabilities and lawsuits given new rules, and had a very good conversation. And if you could go to the next slide, this is where we ended up. And this is new information. It's very important to have our state-required reserve at 4%. You'll notice in blue, there's something called a board policy, and that's the committed reserve. This is 31%, and what that brings together is the 15% recommended by the California Department of Education, the uncertainty over state and federal revenues. We know that the state, especially if you're a community-funded district, can pass along, or not pass along, funds for certain programs. Talked about that. Talked about the catastrophic losses due to natural disasters, and also unplanned legal liabilities. The unplanned legal liabilities was very tough because we really don't, that I think is the one area that was great. The other areas we really had a lot of good content and analysis for. But the short end of it is, we came up with really a 35% reserve, 4% being required, 31% being the board designations. And we worked that into a draft policy for your consideration, and you'll see it here on the next slide. What it does is it really breaks down into three areas, the policy. The first is similar to what you've seen before, it's just that there's a minimum reserve, and for the size of your district, that's 4%. The second one is really speaking to the entirety of the reserves, economic uncertainty. And what we've done there is we've taken that 4% required, and we've taken 4 designations, and we've wrapped them here into an economic uncertainty reserve. I want to just take a minute. I know that you have an opportunity to read this, and I'm sure many of you had. I did notice here, and I'd like to bring it to your attention, this word additional really should be done. And when I went through and I changed some of the policy language, that held over. So just for the record, it would be okay. Financing uses as the reserve for economic uncertainty. The third item really wraps up the assignment. It gives the superintendent, it delegates the power to basically say, through your budgeting process as you're setting these reserves, that there are certain categories that you can assign amounts to of that 31%. They are the credit designation for the state, the categorical uncertainties, catastrophic losses, unplanned liability. And there might be other things that we cannot think about now, but the idea is that you take that 31% and through your process, and Keith, if you wouldn't mind just going back to the prior slide, you can see that it's in this area that there can be some adjustments. So in the policy, we're not going for hard numbers and percentages here, but what we're saying is when we look at the district, we want a 35% reserve, 4% is required by the state, 31 has these policy designations, and based on our recent history and what we know today, this is where those designations break down. So with that, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you have.
I have a question just about the policy language. Can we go to that? This last third bullet, do you really think that it's important, and if you think it's important, can you speak why it's important that the superintendent assign out between these categories? Or is it just that we should set a number and say it's because of these reasons? In other words, is there a policy or legal reason that the budget would then break out between all of these different things? Because one, that seems like an administrative burden, and two, I guess it seems like that would be difficult to adjust on a year-to-year basis. So I just want to know if there's a reason.
Yeah, so reserves can be committed by the board, they can be assigned by the superintendent. They're usually this policy or administrative step when you do your assignments. So if you can...
Could we just say we would have a reserve for economic uncertainties, which would then include for all of those things?
Right.
In other words, is there a reason to delineate on the budget? Or I just want to know if there's
it was more of just more of a logical approach. So if you go back, if you would mind, go back to the prior slide. This is where our board policy is, right? With these two things. So when we came up with the concept of having buckets, how do those funds actually get into their bucket? And that's what that third paragraph is doing. And then these were the designations that we had available. I think through your prior budgets, and not that that's binding in any way, there's always been these categories, assigned categories. So that's the thinking, that's the why of how we got there. Is it required? I would say it's not required, but it helps explain that bigger number as to where funds, what topics that they can go with.
Okay, so you're seeing it more as a way to be clear and communicate out why the reserves are at that amount. Okay.
Can you just remind me, the community funded designation is 15% in addition to the 4% state required.
Correct.
And that's how we got to the 35% in the language, because it was 31 plus 4. Okay. Are there any other questions for Mr. Small right now?
Thank you.
Wait, I have one, just a clarifying question. I was waiting to see if anyone, so if we were to do this, and in our board policy, the board delegates the superintendent. So it's just like a whole, let's say legal liabilities. That's just a holding place of potentially 5%. But the board could use, there's some awful legal thing. We could use 10%. I mean,
100%. So that's the nice thing, if you wouldn't mind, if you come back to that slide. Yeah, so we're not defining how much goes in each bucket, because we know that it's going to change, and there might be other purposes that they're not important now, but maybe in a year or two they might be. So your hands are not tied, but as we sit here, December 16th, this is, and if you go back to the next slide, sorry, the prior slide, this is where we believe it makes sense for the district to be. Again, this is not prescribed in policy. This is your policy, and this is how it's being implemented. Yes, sir.
Is there a better way to kind of put it? Because it's almost like, here's my answer and here is how I got to it. And it's kind of all muddied together, and that's why you're getting all these questions from us. I can see 6 years from now, when we are not sitting, maybe some of us are sitting at the table, it helps explain how we got there. Right? But we all started having questions the moment we saw that. So is there another way to present it, which is more user-friendly for people who haven't sat in this meeting, who look outside and they assume because they don't have the second slide to read at the same time. And then that stops conversations.
It's fair. We want to be as user-friendly as we possibly can. We want to be as transparent as we can be. I think that when you look at a board policy, you're looking at your guidance from your board. That will go ahead and get implemented through a budget. And then there might be priorities that may or may not change. This could be what it is today, and that could be static for a period of time. But as future people come through, whether they're at a staff level or a board level, they may change things. And I'll give you an example. In the past, the board it was designating for technology, and talking to Dr. McGrath, Dr. Kim, we decided, well, maybe that's really an expenditure and not really a board designation. And there were some other items like that too. But I think that it is really exploring what is important to the then existing board, and how what those priorities are. So I don't know that I have a better answer than it's a policy document, and this is the practical impact of that.
I'm not sure this is a question to you or if it's to Dr. Kim. Number 5, unassigned and unappropriated. That is something different than what would be the board policy committed.
That's what's left.
It's just what's left.
In other words,
It's the
how
plug.
much we have to,
It's the plug to the balance.
yeah.
It would be the unrestricted reserves that are not committed by board policy and that are not part of that state-required reserve. So it is the delta that's
Okay.
left.
So I'm going to go back to my 4 versus the 15%. When we had our meeting on the 12th, I thought the 4% was inclusive in the 15%. That's one of the things that I'm struggling with a little bit here. So to me, it felt like 4% of that was required by the state, and then they were recommending an additional 11%, not 19%.
Well, 4%, as you know, is that state minimum.
Right.
As a community-funded district, the state has given you a 15%. Historically, the district has had a 4%, and we just felt that it made sense to have that state minimum, keep that in place, and have that recommended community-funded reserve at 15%. I think one of the challenges that we find when we look at policies is that they're very generic. They don't consider a lot of the things that you've considered. They're not doing risk analysis and looking at your tax base and what happens if there's a fire or earthquake or a drop in local funding. So it is a way to really capture those items, and that's why the policy is stated the way it is.
Can I ask a question about 3B, the state and federal funds categorical uncertainty? Could you describe that a little bit? Because since that's 4% and the other one's 4%, is that a similar thing or totally different? Do we need that? I don't know who I should be asking this question to.
If I may, that'd be great. When I was presenting the district's first interim, and that's what the base of this slide was predicated on. So if you note, it's the first interim budget, and that's where Jeff got that restricted balance and the state required minimum reserve. It's going off what was presented to the board in earlier slides. That state and federal funds categorical uncertainty, that 1.2 million, represents the state and federal revenues that were included in that budget.
So that is a designation of if we lost all state funding, our additional state funding, and our federal funding.
Yeah, that was with the assumption on one of the ideas that were presented in prior conversations is what if, in a hypothetical situation, the state were to withhold federal and state categorical funding to community-funded districts, right?
Okay.
In the event that were to occur, that would represent $1.2 million in the current first interim budget, which would represent about 4%.
Okay, thank you.
And just to clarify, I show on the first interim budget that state sources were 1.228 and that federal sources were 466. So it's actually less.
It's a little bit less.
It's less than we have.
Okay.
Because I added those up, they're more like, I believe, around 6%.
And Sherry, to your question also about the 4% perhaps being included in the 15, one of the ways that the CDE defines the basic aid or community-funded recommendation, it does include the idea of economic uncertainty. So it could be that maybe you were thinking that category, perhaps of that 4%, not the state minimum, but maybe that 4%. So just wanted to put that out there that they do define that similarly.
I just remember having a conversation about the grid, and we sort of said,
We had more on the grid last time.
the
but
board discussion, but we were sort of eliminating the state requirement of 4% because we were going to take the recommendation of the CDE minimum recommendation of 15%.
And you could still in the same way do that. You could say we're setting aside 15. That 15 includes the 4 state requirement and 11 additional.
That's what I thought we were doing. So that was why I was asking.
Okay. Yeah. I think we're probably going to need to discuss all of this.
Yeah. Why don't, how about this? How about we bring back a first draft that's written in kind of policy draft language. And we will start with the 4% being part of the 15. So instead, kind of 4 and 11, the other components. I think the one question is, do you want it assigned per topic in an amount, or do you want a total with the topics just mentioned?
Can I just ask clarifying, are we in board discussion? Because don't we need to take public comment?
Yeah, I think we're just in the question section.
Yeah, so
Sorry,
I
jumped
think,
to, yeah, thank you.
I think we need to defer on what we would like
Right,
to
do
see
you want
back.
to go to comment then?
Yeah.
Austin? Sorry about that.
Okay, so are there any more questions for Mr. Small? Oh, okay. Public comment on this? Okay, seeing none, moving to board
Oh, I
deliberation.
saw one.
Yes, sorry.
I do appreciate seeing the financial overview along with the interim numbers. It helps to see it all together, which we haven't had a chance to do yet. I hope that the board continues to carefully assess the need for this fund and carefully assess the language that would go into a policy so that we are just careful about how we're presenting that information. Last time we heard from our consultant, I did remember there was some discussion about doing some more stakeholder outreach. And I'm just curious what other stakeholders besides attendees of these board meetings have been included in this conversation.
Thank you, Ms. Baker. Okay, board deliberation. Who would like to?
Well, maybe we should start with what Sherry was raising, which is whether we want 4 plus 15 or whether the 15 includes the 4. I mean, I think.
Yeah, I was thinking that you were picking either or because we are not because we are a community funded district, we would go under the recommendation that the CDE is saying to reserve for a community funded district. So it's actually not inclusive of the 4. It's just what they would, because they're mutually exclusive and we don't fall into both categories, we fall into one. So I would go on the recommendation that was what I was assuming as well. I didn't think they would be combined, but, and that's just this minimum basis, to set that as a policy. Because I think 4% is too low for our district, that's why I was going with more what the CDU recommended. So I'm thinking the same thing.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Sandeep, sir.
I haven't been in the previous conversations, but here are some thoughts. One reason why you would keep 4% aside is because if you go below the threshold, there's probably some price to pay for that. So ideally, what you want to do is, if you really want to put reserves for emergency use or whatever designations you want to put on that, you want to make sure that you don't ever go below 4%, even if you have to use those funds. So that's one thought. Or we go down the other path, which is that we decide what is our true reserve, and that's that. And of course, if it's above 4%, it meets the 4% threshold anyway, so it doesn't matter.
That's a good point. If it's a state-required reserve, it's just locked in. So we should consider it just sort of this absolute basis.
Yeah.
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 What I was thinking though was I would adjust A to 11 then. So we still keep it out as a required reserve, but we adjust the community funded to 11, knowing that we have to have 4 already.
Right.
Yeah, and then I believe that when we talked last, we thought that quote CDE covered things like economic downturn, which is a huge risk that we're not specifically calling out.
Yeah.
It would also, I think, covered OPEB to the extent that you would reserve for OPEB. Like it had like sort of things that are baked in, and then we were trying to call out with these other ones, like things that we thought were very specific risks to our community, which are the catastrophic loss of tax base, and then the state and federal funds, and then the legal liability. And then I want to talk about whether I think it makes sense to call it out here or just in the policy. I don't like calling it out here. I feel like if anything, we want to be clear, we could say board reserves per policy and call out the number of the policy so that if anyone is ever like, why do you have this? It directs them exactly to our thinking as to what is in the reserve.
Right.
Because I think Sandeep made a really good point. Like if we set this number at a certain thing, then the superintendent has to always manage those categories to that number, which is a little artificial and forces the superintendent to be figuring out like each year, maybe we have a different risk. And it just feels like a lot of work. When in reality, we're sort of saying, we've looked at these different things and this is why we've come up with this number. That's my view on sort of how this is organized.
I feel the same. I feel like we're not trying to be incredibly restrictive and create requirements or additional requirements that you need to meet each year based on a policy. We want to keep it open enough to say there is a policy that includes designations identified in these 4 categories. And maybe potential, I don't know if we want to just say it's going to be in these 4 categories or if there's room for additional categories that can be made.
Well, I think the way the policy was written,
It was a little bit open.
it was a little open. I mean, what I would do is almost say the district maintains a minimum committed fund balance of not less than
30.
whatever percent we figure out, because it sounds like that might get adjusted, inclusive of the percentages that are required here. The state required. And then for these reasons, and then that last section basically gets moved up and says that we do this, it's prudent to maintain a high bond rating, protect the districts from effects of fluctuation in property tax revenues, to which this, including catastrophic loss due to natural disaster, unplanned liability, and like the other things that we've
Or other
called out.
purposes to the
Yeah,
committed fund balance. Yeah, so it just gives you a little bit of room if there were something
Yeah.
else that needed to be designated, but it's essentially the percentage is what we're speaking towards. And there's quite a bit of,
and we need to mention the CDE,
Allocation,
obviously. I unfortunately skipped over that one.
And it's also an opportunity for giving direction to the future board members. This is a thought process, how we came up with it. And if we are in exchange, that's the template to
adjust.
right, which is what this is really.
Yeah, and we review our policies regularly, and this policy, we could say the board would review every
5 years.
Yeah, every certain number of years.
To make it easier, and that's less paperwork to you.
Yeah, and then, this comes back before the board so that people can say, oh, that's what they did. Does this number still make sense given where we are?
Yeah.
We've just had a massive earthquake and we saw what happened, so now we can adjust. And I also want to give people if we did have to dip into these because of these reasons, I'm assuming it gets approved by the board because they approve the budget, and the superintendent and the CBO would come before the board and say, we're going below the 35% because we just had an earthquake and we need to spend it down. I mean, that makes sense. So does that make sense on policy?
Yeah, it's like, to me, it's a good balance of like being specific and explaining why we are doing this, but still flexibility in how we would spend it.
Yeah, do we need to define what we consider possible uses for the designation?
So
How do we define that, or is that just something does that need to be defined in the board policy? Because we certainly don't want to restrict it in case of emergency.
Well, so we have community funded designation per CDE, which would account for economic uncertainty. Is that correct? Is that the correct
I don't know that
understanding?
CDE calls out economic uncertainty. It was just that we figured that was what was baked into CDE.
Is there a language that the state has on how to use that 4% that they have set aside?
Well, we're thinking of the
My
15%.
point is that if that's the language, they've assumed 4% equals 100%, right? So they might have a language which talks about what's the potential uses for reserve. And we just expand this to 4%, now we're talking 15, 20, 35%.
I mean, I think we can basically almost use what's in the CDE policy as our template because it says it maintains a minimum unassigned fund balance of not less than 15%. I think it's pretty, I think this policy kind of, and it basically says that it can be, it's not specifically assigned. So therefore, the administration has the ability to say, we need to dip into this. And I would want our, whatever came back to us to make sure that we had the ability to authorize its spending in an emergency
board vote?
situation.
Board vote, or what would
Well,
allow you to do that? I guess you'd have to do, that's what I was asking.
I guess like either the approval of a budget or a board vote on an adjustment to it. Like if there was emergency spending for another pandemic, I mean, we're not calling that out, but it would just seem like we would just have to authorize the expenditure, right?
Yeah, I just, anytime I've ever seen a borrow, like I think of it like an endowment, like borrowing against it, you usually try to plan out how it gets used, what it's allowed to be used for, and then the repayment terms, how you get it repaid, so.
Yeah, I think
But
it's
this
a
may be
little
different.
different because it's
Yeah.
living in our general fund and we're not talking about moving it to a separate fund. And if
Yeah.
we engage in that conversation later, maybe we build that in if we go back to that separate fund issue.
Is that language that can be added on if we have to go less than X percent, this is how it would be done? Is that something that goes in board policy or would that be in AR?
I mean, Dr. Kim, I believe that it would be board approval to move it from one to the other, right?
Yeah.
And that, I don't think you even need policy, that is just practice.
Okay.
That is my current understanding as well. The policy informs the commitment in order to then withdraw in essence from that committed amount, then we would just need board action by which to do so.
Yeah. So the other thing I would say is that on the budget, I would specifically name the board policy. And obviously, we don't have a number for it yet, but just for future, like instead of just saying it's board policy, just put the number in so that we're being very clear to the public as to what it is. Anyone who wants to go look. And then should we talk about
The percentage.
percentages, the percentage, since it's going to be just a number?
So right now, it says 35% because it is, right now, it is the 4% plus these other designations, 3A through D. Do we agree, do we want to talk about as a board if we want to just have that the 4% inclusive of the 15%? For me, I think it's important to have at least that acknowledgement of 15% so that future boards, and we all know that it's coming from a recommendation versus saying 11 plus 4. I mean, I would just be like.
Well, I think we can call it out. It's just a question of how we add it up.
Yeah. So.
So I'll say, I mean, I think we should come back to that, but I also think the state and federal funds might be a little high. Like, it feels to me like if we're looking at it's 6-ish% of our budget, like why are we reserving 2/3? Maybe because we already have the quote 15%, like it might be more accurately set at like 2 or 3%. That one feels a little high to me.
If I could, my apologies, just take a moment to clarify. Realize that the district had started with the state and federal combined amount and then rounded at up to 4% because it was 3.x% and it just rounded it to 4%. So the $1.2 million represents a flat 4% of operating expenditures.
Okay, I'm looking at the revenue and I see 1.228 from state sources and 466, that's higher.
Yeah, that was higher. So.
That one feels a little high to me. I think we said, because we said catastrophic loss from fire was 12.5 plus 6%, so that's 18.5, so we're taking a little less than half of that. I mean, you never reserve like the full amount. Like you always reserve like some percentage.
And legal is legal and special ed combined.
Yeah. Legal might be high, but that was just when I think it's there because we don't know. It could be anything.
Yeah, well, I think because it had special ed in it, because when we combine them together, then it is more in alignment.
Of what special ed could look like.
So if I remember the conversation about state and federal funds categorical, it was because if another thing comes down, like another, pre-K kind of thing, where we're just stuck paying for it again without getting any additional funding, I think that's what that was.
Yeah.
But it only lasts for a year. It's not
Well,
that wouldn't even fund our program for a year, so.
Yeah, well, we'd have to figure out, I mean, a reserve is never going to fund it forever. It's just going to have to
Bridge.
smooth while we adjust other parts of the budget, right?
Yeah. But I think that's where that conversation was directed, right? That we thought that
Yeah.
as we continue to see state funds, no one seems to be able to attack all the Prop 13, all the
That seems like a big.
this seems like an area that they can go after to us and not without attacking Prop 13.
I thought it was two things. One, they could add new unfunded mandates, or two, they could take away existing state funds and be like, until you filled, you're not getting a penny of this money. So I think it's both, and that's the reason that we put it separate from the 15%.
Yeah, I remember that. Okay.
But then would 4% be sufficient, or should it be reduced down?
It does seem like the
Less.
full amount was, so maybe you want that more, half of that?
Yeah.
Maybe you want it more at 2%?
What, is the full amount
Yeah.
4%, or is the full amount the 6%?
It's rounded up to 4.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're getting a little into the
To the weeds.
I'm just saying, because I don't want to imply that all this work is now getting too weedy, but I think that I feel very comfortable based on our conversations that these are the appropriate buckets in which we should be setting aside, our reserve policy for. The 4% to 3%, it doesn't, that is going to move. I anticipate, just based on whatever happens in the future. But I think that, I'm looking at, am I comfortable with it being 35% that we're writing a policy towards? Am I comfortable with that? Does that just as a whole bucket seem high? Should it be 30% or 33% or 1/3? Something, that's where I'm leaning. And I'm not trying to do, I was thinking, I don't know if I have an answer to these nuances. I don't know if we do, but I do appreciate these buckets because they've been presented to us. We know we need to have a reserve for these key categories here. And there might be another one that gets added and it might have to swing between them, but
Yeah, I guess I was just trying to figure out how we add up the numbers.
I agree.
I just don't, I hate picking a number out of the air, so I'm trying to add up the numbers so that we
I'm
get
doing
to
the
a
same.
number that seems
Does
right.
5% seem high?
Yes.
It seems high.
Okay,
It's too
that's
high.
right.
Too high.
And so that's what we're, if 35% seems high, 33% is 1/3. I mean, or is it still too high? Let's pare it down. If that's where we're going, Sherry, then I think we should be cognizant of it just being a little too high.
Well, I
So
think.
then, instead of getting kind of, with the exception of the 15%, so instead of getting kind of cut up with 4, 7, 5, I mean, maybe we should talk about what the board feel comfortable as what the minimum percentage.
And this goes to, again, back to precedent and other feedback or stakeholder, the only other, I drilled down, when we were at the ranch, I was trying to better understand their reserve policy, and they have rationale behind their reserve policy, which is to keep 50% of their admin and diurnal expenses in reserves. That is their policy. It's very clearly written, and that fluctuates based on what their admin and diurnal expenses are. They need to keep 50% of what those expenses would be in reserves, and so it goes up and down over the years. But I appreciated it. It was very clean, and they felt comfortable with it. And so I thought, okay, well, having a reserve policy that has rationale, which is what we're putting into this, that was my stakeholder feedback. But I don't know if we need additional feedback.
So I'll throw out an idea. So if you change the funded designation to 11%, right? So because we have to keep the state required above. If you keep state and federal funds to 2%, you leave catastrophic loss at 7%, and you leave unplanned legal liabilities at 5%, you end up at 25%. Plus the additional 4% from the state.
So we'd end up at 29.
29.
Do we have what the other community funded districts around us have a specific policy? And have you done the comparison?
We did. We
And
did.
I'm really careful not to ask too many questions because you guys have clearly spent time on this. So I don't want to talk reinvent the wheel here.
There was a prior presentation, which I'm trying to look for it. We did. The takeaway was most people haven't. There were a couple of districts that had set numbers, but it wasn't entirely clear how they got to their numbers. Right. TAM Union is the one in Marin that I recall, and they are the CDE 15%, but they're a much broader geographic base.
I think they're even like 17%, so then that's makes you question, well, why not 15? Where does the 2% come?
Like, I think better memory than me.
Yeah.
But it was something where it was just slightly off, and that's what I would love for us to be able to have a rationale of why we're doing what we're doing.
And that kind of is helping us get to a rationale. The question is, are the percentages where it makes sense or not? And I'm not sure I understand what the parameters should be, whether it should be 5% or whether it's conservative at 5%, whether it's aggressive at 5%. I don't have that benchmark.
So one thing, you could go back to the last board meeting. If you go back and pull the agenda, there was a presentation where Jeff went through and we drilled down on risk analysis of like what happens after. And I can read you the high-level summaries.
I think my thing is that you guys were there, right? But
We were
it
there.
seems like there's no clarity even after going through that presentation.
Well, I
Because
think,
it's all risk, it's all weighted probabilities of
Yeah.
which we are not experts.
right.
Right.
Yeah.
So there,
So
it's,
we have to go
there
with
is no,
somebody's recommendation.
we've got to go with someone's recommendation. So if we were to use this is Jeff's best estimate for us. This is his
Yeah.
recommendation.
And we have gone out to the community. I have gone out and solicited lots of feedback. I have gotten no specific feedback. I have gone to community groups. I've made phone calls to people who I think in the community would have an expertise on financial. I've made phone calls to prior board members. I've gotten nothing that is more than what Jeff has given us. And given that what he has given us is based off of a lot of research that we asked him to do, he did a ton. He looked at what happened in a lot of other districts. He looked at what's happened in Reed Union historically. So
what's keeping us from going with that recommendation then?
Feels too high.
Just a gut check.
yeah, so just I think this will catch you up slightly. So the high level numbers that he came to last board meeting were the state requirement of 4%, the CDE minimum of 15%, catastrophic loss of tax base based on the risk analysis was a 12.5% loss of tax base plus a 6% catch up because it took longer for the tax base to recover. There was an economic downturn, which was 2.5 2.3% loss of tax base plus a 6% catch-up. The last meeting, we decided that that was encompassed by the CDE recommendation of the 15%. Then we couldn't attach a number to the liabilities and lawsuits last time, but we combined it with special ed needs based on what we see in past budgets.
And that was what we thought. was
And
about
that's that 5% number. But that one's a bit of a stab in the dark.
That takes us to what, 20 right now at this point?
But the catastrophic loss of tax base was the 12.5 plus 6%. So that was 18.5% if you had a catastrophic loss of tax base. But the question is, how much should you reserve of that if you had an 18.5% swing, right? What else is on there? Community funded designation. And then there's this general, we did a big deep dive because of how our funding is different from most school districts that we're funded only through our property taxes. There has been a lot of discussion in the California government levels about trying to equalize between community funded and LCFF districts as that gap has widened. And so there is a political judgment that the board is making about the loss of potential state money as well as federal money, which goes through the state government. I think that catches him up. I think that's sort of like a really, really bullet point summary.
Thank you, Chris. I really appreciate that.
Yeah. So now we're trying to figure out, based on that historical and what Jeff's put together, does this number seem right, given that, like, we have to combine community funded, the 15% plus these others?
And I think what I'm hearing from Sherry is that 35% seems too high, primarily because it seems almost that we're double counting state required
Yes.
reserves in the community funded designation. So I would advocate either bringing the 35 down to 31, taking that 4% and just and putting it in, or if we still feel that like 7% is too high for catastrophic loss, then make it 30%. But I think 25% now almost takes out a lot of this research and brings it too low, but I'm just trying to listen to what I'm hearing from Sherry.
So 27, so 27 would be the perfect number, so in my. Well, because
Tell me how you get to 27.
Because you keep the 15, you assume that the state and federal funds would be included within the community funded designation, right? That even though that's not perfect, you
Okay.
hold catastrophic loss due to natural disasters as it is, even though that might also be a tiny bit too high. And then you go with unplanned legal liabilities and special ed.
So that takes you to 27.
Yeah, that's how I got. But I could also be convinced that catastrophic should only be 5%, and then that's how I got to 25. So I don't know.
I think that if we're going to take out state and federal funding categorical uncertainty, which I'm okay with, I'm not comfortable taking catastrophic loss down. Was just my feeling on that. But I do agree with you. The 15 and the 4 feel like double counting. 100% agree.
So I just brought to attention that we have board policy that says our board meetings do not go past 10:30 p.m. unless there is a motion to extend our meeting. So
And can I give a suggestion that I feel like we're close? How about I bring back a first reading of a policy that lands it in a place that is close there? I could even get input from the 2 finance board members in bringing it back. And then I would suggest that we not even put our second reading into consent, that we even kind of bring it back for a second reading as well. So I think I have enough to be able to move us forward on a full first reading, and I could bring that back to the next meeting.
Okay.
Could that work for a good next step?
Yes.
And just on the same page, so what percentage, from what you've heard, what percentage are you going to include?
I can check with the 2 finance reps, but I'm
Okay.
thinking either it's at the 29 total, right? 25 plus the 4. for 29 total, or the 27?
27, because it's inclusive of
The 4 is
the
included.
4 is included in the 15.
And the consensus is that 4 is being double counting.
Okay, so 27.
Well,
And let's bring that back, and then we can continue.
We
with
have a whole
discussion.
nother first read list.
yeah, no, but I mean, you're saying the 4 that the state required, you're
And I'm
taking out
killing
the
that
state and federal
categorical.
funds, you're removing the 4%. So
Yep.
that's 27 it's included, and you're taking out line item of state and federal funds categorical uncertainty.
Correct.
Which is, if that's what the consensus is, because otherwise it would be 31.
31.
Yeah.
Or 27.
Okay. Okay.
So
Somewhere
we
in
can have further discussion about whether or not we will remove 3B. Is that,
Absolutely.
because I'm not sure that we as a board have a consensus on
On
removing
3B, but
items.
definitely the double counting is, okay.
Okay. All right, so there's no motion that we,
No motion. I'll bring it back to a first reading. Might I suggest that we finish the policy work at the next meeting? You could do the public hearing,
okay.
finish the.
Okay, so we will bring,
items. Is that, you should make a motion for that, though. Is it
Okay.
okay to move those to
so
the next
is
meeting?
there a motion to move the first readings of the 11 board policies that were in this agenda to be brought back for, and on the agenda for the next board meeting? And we'll have discussion then. Is there a motion for, is that, am I saying that? Is there a motion for that?
I'll make the motion.
Is there a second? Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Okay. And then we don't have to do any motion for reserve policy?
Correct. I'll
back?
bring it back as a first draft.
Okay, so item P10, future items for trustee consideration. Are there any items that people would like to bring up for future consideration?
Something that just came up is, and I don't know if we want to bring it up, but it's facilitating the process to find coaches. I just feel that it's such a great thing that we do.
You know what? I appreciate that, Liz, so much. What I would recommend is, as Mr. Silva was saying, there's this movement to possibly change to a kind of county.
Right.
And so I might suggest
Let's
let's let that process play out, see if it helps the process, and then, see if he needs other support after that.
Yes, okay, I think that's a good idea.
Okay, are there any other future items for consideration? Okay, moving on to item Q, public hearings. We have a public hearing for our initial interests of the Reed Union School District on entering into negotiations with RDTA. I'm opening a public hearing. Is there any public comment? Okay, closing public hearing at 10:28. And we are closing our meeting at 10:28.